Good morning here from California. Good evening to our audience in Asia. Good afternoon to the East Coast. We have a great panel here addressing that topic of end-to-end visibility, by which we really mean making sure that if different people look at different topics from different perspectives, they are talking about the same thing. Our panel has different dimensions to bring to the table. Let me introduce our panel here. Helen Yu is the founder and chief executive officer of Tiger Advisory. She has a great perspective in bringing companies up to speed. Our second panelist is Cynthia Cox, who's responsible for security and compliance at Marqeta. And our third speaker is Komitas Stepanyan, who is the CIO at the Central Bank of Armenia. Helen, can you briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, Thomas. Hello, everyone. It's an honor to be here today. I'm the founder and CEO of Tigon Advisory. It's a pleasure being here with everyone today.
Cynthia, can you give us just a brief intro for yourself?
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Cynthia, and I've been practicing GRC and Cyber Security for the last 18 plus years at some large companies like Symantec and KPMG as an auditor, and Palo Alto Networks prior to my time at Marqeta. And I pretty much touched all the disciplines of GRC, whether they be policies, customer, supplier trust, privacy. It's all been fun, and I love learning all about it and here with you guys today.
Thank you, Cynthia. Komitas, to you. Thanks for joining us. It's quite late in Armenia.
Yes. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. It's a great pleasure to join to this panel. I'm quite new CIO. Just a month I'm sitting in this position as a CIO. Before that, I was auditing all IT and cybersecurity employees and the service at the Central Bank of Armenia, and I cooperate very closely with the IMF and the World Bank as a cybersecurity expert.
Thank you so much. Let's get started. I would ask you to share your perspective, and I think we have three very different perspectives from different cybersecurity professionals. If you have listened to the sessions early in the day, it's very evident that one key role, for instance, of a chief information security officer is always to bring together the business perspective and the IT perspective, but there are many other perspectives to look at. And I think, Helen, at Tigon, you have worked with lots of companies basically on integrating these perspectives. Can you share briefly how you look at this topic?
Sure, Thomas. Let me first highlight the three most common cybersecurity priorities: the shift from prevention to resilience, the focus on data privacy, and then third-party supply chain risk mitigation. So building a culture of cybersecurity does not happen by default. It takes vision, planning, and investment. The common denominator is that cybersecurity controls consistently revolve around three key factors: people, processes, and technology. This is why having a single source to truth will help organizations better understand how your employees use, manage, and exchange data, how work takes place, what checks and balances you have established, and if, when, and where organizations should make investment.
Thank you, Helen. I think this focus on changing a culture is essential to all of us. Cynthia, how would you summarize this whole topic of end-to-end visibility?
I think that you guys may be familiar with this saying. It came from a movie called Follow the Money, and it was really talking about fraud and following the money to figure out what really happened. And I think in our field, we really need to change that catchphrase to follow the data. So for me, in order to really drive end-to-end visibility, enable our businesses to make good decisions, we have to really understand the data lifecycle. So if you look at it, you're thinking, where's the data created? A lot of times we're getting data from our third party. So there's your third party risk management, you're generating data from your customers. There's going to be privacy concerns about that as well. You're going to be asking where's your data stored. Again, your cloud providers is a key component of that as well. Your resiliency also, right? Because where is it stored? Can you back up? Is it encrypted? All those really great controls there. I think once it's in your data set, once it's within your boundaries, you also have to think about who's using it. Who are my users? Where are they located? Do I have geographical issues? Do I have concerns about duplication? I think we've all been really surprised throughout our multiple audits to learn about a new data lake that we never knew about before. And, we find out that a lot of times that QA has data that maybe wasn't properly sanitized, those type of things. And then finally, the end of the life cycle is obviously the data retention. How long? You have regulatory requirements. We have privacy requirements with the DSAR, and then how is it purged? Same idea, especially with the DSAR, the data subject access request. We really need to make sure that we can delete that data. And the only way that we can have this end-to-end visibility and uncover those crown jewels and those key risks is by understanding how data is transformed, how is it used, how is it stored, so on and so forth.
Thank you, Cynthia. I think we already have two great perspectives of what it means to have end-to-end visibility. Helen said it's really about the cultural view from different perspectives. Cynthia, you just said it's really about the data, because data have their own life cycle. At different stages of the life cycle, different things can happen. Komitas, what is your perspective? I think you have this unique position of being a cybersecurity professional, but at the same time, representing the Central Bank of Armenia, you also have the role of regulating basically other players in the industry. So what is your perspective?
Thank you very much, Thomas. It's really a great question. I fully agree with my colleagues about concept of people, process, and technologies. And I would like to emphasize people component or people domain. When we say cybersecurity is not there by default, and culture is very crucial component or very important component, and we are in a GRC summit, although I have a deep technical knowledge and I can talk about, backups, encryption, etc., I would like to share my perspective from governance view. I think cybersecurity governance is one of the main components, because you may have state-of-art technologies, you may have, the best mature processes. Without proper leadership from top management, without proper culture in your organization, you cannot reach the proper level of cybersecurity and proper level of cyber resilience. So organizational leadership coming from the top management is the crucial component of this people, process, technologies triangle. But what concerns to the perspective of the regulator as a Central Bank of Armenia, or many central banks are regulators for the financial sector. Central bank as an organization is very regulated one. And we have that responsibility to regulate our financial sector. From our perspective, we have already implemented some standards like ISO 27001 in our organization, and now it's required for all financial players, credit companies, commercial banks, insurance companies, and other institutions like payment system organizations. They have to comply with ISO 27001, which is also part of governance. So from my perspective, governance is one of the main components of dealing today's cybersecurity risks, and to come to a good point to say my organization is ready to deal with cyber threats nowadays.
Thank you, Komitas. This brings really up a very interesting perspective. And Helen, I would actually ask you to comment on that. In this specific situation, sure, of a regulator on the one hand, and you typically working with companies to accelerate their journey to a more resilient organization, how do you see actually this? How does it feel to talk to a regulator here? What's your feeling about that? What's your experience? How the regulator really shapes what you have to do as an enterprise?
That's a great question, Thomas. I will give you a typical consultant answer. It all depends. If I were a financial service info security professional, I would have so much to do that already exceeding any realistic capacity. Then, getting or to deal with the regulator is definitely not on my bucket list. However, as an individual and consumer who have often been the victim of identity theft, we can all appreciate the need for all business that maintain this important data of ours to be on the same page as what it means to protect our data. So I would say, they're both friend and foe.
Thank you, Helen. You just basically redirected to the topic that Cynthia had brought up earlier. Of course, if we talk about end-to-end visibility, data is somehow central. Cynthia, you had brought that up earlier, the data lifecycle, how we can create consistency. How do you see that in this context of regulatory requirements and, of course, normal business requirements?
Yeah, actually, I'd have to say, just as a follow-up, that my regulators, I think, are, in general, a great thing, because just like in security, unfortunately, we have to take advantage of a well-timed breach, because I think we all know from the stories that after a breach occurred, that's kind of when you have management's ear, and you really have to capitalize on that. And so I have to say that using the role of the regulator to say, well, you have to do this because the regulator said so, is actually a really good hammer to use when necessary. So I definitely have to appreciate that component of the regulator. Now, I will say, as Komitas mentioned, right, ISO 27001 is definitely an international standard. It's right there in the title. Whereas in the US, we might be more focused on maybe some of the NIST standards or the SOC 1 and the SOC 2. So definitely one of the rules that I like to do in the GRC space is to harmonize my control frameworks, because in your industry, you're going to have specific frameworks as well. You're going to have HIPAA, maybe if you're in healthcare, or if you're in education, you have others. The list, unfortunately, is a complete alphabet soup, and it's really overwhelming. And we have to remember audit fatigue on our stakeholder side. So our role is really to make sure we harmonize those control frames so that we can do that, one control to many, and really make sure we're focused on the right controls for our industry, for our customers, for best practices, whatever that means. And by harmonizing control framework, we can have a really clear message to management what the key risks are.
Thank you, Cynthia. I think this brings up really a great perspective. When we talk about end-to-end visibility, harmonizing controls is really central. And I would actually like to play that back to you, Komitas. This whole point of having multiple frameworks, obviously you're to some extent the framework setter when you decide that ISO 27001 is the key framework for the banks and financial institutions in Armenia. But I think the topic is also pertinent to you. End-to-end visibility, I think what Cynthia just said, is also making sure that if we have 10 different frameworks, that we still have a harmonized view, that we're really talking about the same thing through all these frameworks. And for instance, in the US, the FFIEC cyber advisory tool is somehow the standard tool for most banks. That's the starting point. That in turn is mapped to things like NIST SP 853 or to NIST CSF. So what's your take on this, and specifically also in the context, how this is evolving? ISO 27001 is now 7 years old, so it is to some extent dated. So what's your perspective on these multiple frameworks and being consistent across these?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's another great question. I can share something from my experience working as an employee of the central bank, and some experience from being a cybersecurity expert and traveling lots of countries with IMF to share some experience with other colleagues from worldwide. So, when you are using different frameworks, from one hand, it's an opportunity to be sure that you are not missing something. It's very important. But on the other hand, when you have 10 different frameworks, sometimes you need to harmonize, and sometimes you have to do lots of doubling. So you are doing something based on the one framework. When we are looking at the second framework, you see that most of the part of the first framework is already included in the second one. Before implementing and before coming to the conclusion that we need to implement ISO 27001, we were using COVID framework, which from my perspective, is one of the best governance framework for governing IT, information or cybersecurity. Today, there is another one, NIST, and you already mentioned FFIEC, which is one of my favorite frameworks. But there is one important issue there. Sometimes I saw that some people just download some NIST or FFIEC framework and try to translate by their own national language, because, for example, in Armenia, we use our national language. In African countries, they use their own, and they are just downloading this framework and trying to use by their own. And if you look at the FFIEC, I can bring just one small example. There is inherent risk assessment part of the FFIEC framework, and there is a question about service providers. For example, if you have from 1 to 3 service providers, 1 to 5 service providers, it means your risk is very low. If you have from 10 to 15, your risk is medium, and if you have over 50 service providers, insurance service providers, then your risk is high. For example, in my country, we have like 3 service providers overall in the country. So this framework doesn't suit for my needs, and I need to implement this framework which really cover our needs based on our situation. So in some countries, I saw that people are just looking these tools. They are using these tools to assess their cybersecurity readiness or maturity based on the FFIEC, and at the end, they get some wrong results. Why we use this ISO 27001? Because we did lots of research that time. That part of time, it was 2007, if I'm not mistaken, and I was the first responsible person in the Central Bank of Armenia, and I'm proud of that. I was in the roots of implementing the standard in our bank. At that point of time, it was one of the best. But once again, before implementing this, we were using COVID, and COVID has its own matching tables with the ISO 27001. And when we did our first assessment, self-assessment, how many % of our processes are comply with the ISO 27001, it was like more than 85%. So even when you are using one framework, you can use lots of matching tables, lots of harmonizing tools to be sure that you are covering all aspects of cybersecurity. Doesn't matter which framework you use.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Komitas. I think that really extends the point that Cynthia had made. Harmonization really of controls is really relying on these multiple mappings between the frameworks. And I also have to say I love how we're really diving into the detail, how these different frameworks interact, because if we talk about a consistent view across the organization, it's also a consistent view on frameworks. The other thing that I think is really interesting, and Helen, it would be great if you could share your perspective on that, is that you, Komitas, you just brought in the third-party aspect, service providers, and of course for all of us, more and more of our business is really not conducted by ourselves, but by third parties, by fourth parties, fifth parties, because of course they have their own partners. The interesting thing here is, and I think ISO 27001 has the big advantage, there's a certification. You can ask your partner to certify, so you have immediately that binding element that you can know on a certain level as much about your partner as about yourself because they're ISO certified. The question to you, Helen, is really if you see that that whole linkage to third parties and your point earlier about the common culture. Obviously, having a security culture is difficult enough in a large organization. If we talk about third parties, how do you really keep that together? Having a shared culture across hundreds of partners and third parties is really a challenge. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very on top of every company's mind, right? We offer managed security service to organizations, oftentimes with limited capital and competing priorities. We see the company push cybersecurity to the end of list. They don't really get us engaged until it's too late. So what we working with them, we help educate their board and CEO and executive team, right? That's from people perspective, because it's so important to have a culture starting from the top that people understand. It's so important to understand the importance of cybersecurity. And then we also really help organizations to establish regular employee training. The training should be beyond the new hire onboarding training. The entire workforce needs to be educated. From process perspective, we help them perform an audit to assess risk landscape. It's so important for companies to understand who manage their cybersecurity, what training the employees already have today versus where the gaps is, and also what are the processes they have in place to keep their organization secure, and what are the crown jewels to protect, understand the risk associated with third party and supply chain. So we usually started off with an inventory list of all the third party vendors they have and supply chain they have to manage, and then understand where the risk endpoint they have to have, and then where the risk might be. And then we also help them establish a cadence to explore the cyber risk. Right, I think Komitas mentioned about NIST earlier, the framework, and the ISO. There are all sorts of different framework. Depends on what industry we're working with. With a highly regulated industry, they may have even more in-depth of compliance they have to follow. And then most importantly, only having the framework does not really help. Most importantly, we help the organization to establish a cross-functional metrics that pertain to cyber risk and cybersecurity. So that's not just an IT job. There's business functions, every single parts of the organizational function, the responsibility to ensure a resilient, secure workplace. Thirdly, is from technology perspective, we help organizations to build layers of defense, right? When I talk about that, it's not just a firewall, it's admin, passphrases, multi-factor authentication, access management, auditing system, SOCs, and this whole 9 yards, right? We talk about defense in depth. And then also, most importantly, to automate that monitoring process to allow the organization to understand the cybersecurity performance and also align their investment with the real world risk. So those are the things that I think it's really critical for organizations to look at from people, process, and technology perspective. That's how they can build a culture when working with third-party vendors or supply chain suppliers.
Thank you, Helen. I think this is a great perspective, and I would like to actually ask Komitas a question around one point that Helen just made. She said at the core of it is also having metrics. So obviously it's about multiple dimensions, but in order to make sure that people look at the topic in the same way, the metrics are really essential. And there are, of course, many metrics that we see a lot now are cyber maturity metrics, where you rate a certain part of the organization in a certain aspect as a 5 or as a 3. And let me redirect that to you, Komitas, from a regulatory perspective. And sorry that you have to play that role of the regulator here all the time.
No problem.
Are you actually in a position to go out and say, yeah, you are a bank and I rate you as a 3 in some dimension? Or how do you feel about doing these kinds of judgments? I think in our experience, it really helps to make this judgment. And it's not like a grade in school where you have a pass or fail. It's more a path to improvement. So how do you see this whole metrics element in terms of creating that end-to-end visibility?
Yeah, this is the most important part of cybersecurity, I think. First of all, I would like to bring one small sentence from COVID. In COVID, you can find something like this: if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So if we can't measure something, we can say we are doing this thing in a good way, or we need to improve something. So when we are talking about measures, we need to have proper key performance indicators and key risk indicators. Working with the World Bank, I've been a cybersecurity expert, and I developed special KPIs and key risk indicators for banking sector, for financial sector, let's say, for particular jurisdiction. I cannot say the name of the jurisdiction, but this is going to be a common practice for all kinds of jurisdictions, all countries, to have proper measures to implement and then measure as a regulator to be sure that everything under the control, I mean cybersecurity risks under the control in the financial sector. I have my own vision, and I'm going to do the following. I'm going to do the following, I mean Central Bank of Armenia. Before coming to this position, I was deputy head of internal audit, and I was closely working with the methodology department, who is responsible for creating and implementing that measures. So now I'm working as a CIO, who is responsible IT and information cyber security. We are closely working to use this FFIC cybersecurity maturity tool, but we need to update lots of questions based on our situation. Once again, in our country, we have just 3 internet service providers, and we need to change some weights of questions, and using this FFIC tool to create our own. And later on, we are going to use this tool to assess all commercial banks and financial institutions. And I look at this picture like a puzzle. Whenever I have already results of each financial institution, I can put them in one big chart like this map back in my wall, and I can see that in financial sector we have this certain risk. Because if you identify that this particular risk exists in, I don't know, systemically important bank 1, bank 2, and this systemically important organization, then we can say, okay, this risk is out or is over our risk appetite, and we need to do our steps to mitigate this risk, and this risk must be under our risk appetite. This is my perspective.
Okay. Thank you, Komitas, so much. We're actually reaching the point where we have to think about closing up. Cynthia, I would like to ask you to comment on one element here and also basically make your closing statement as we're coming to an end point. You had brought up the element of harmonized controls, and in the very beginning, the element of the data lifecycle. If we link that topic to the metrics, do you see some kind of future where we will have a much clearer way of measuring how well we're doing in terms of data lifecycle, or in terms of our controls frameworks, or what do you think is a practical next step? How do you see the future for these elements?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm not going to say this is easy, but I would say that unfortunately, continuous monitoring and automation, I think, is the way to go, especially as we're scaling and moving into the cloud, into the third-party providers that we don't have overall visibility. So you have to be able to control what you can control. And if you wait until that 1-year audit or that quarterly, user access review, that's just too late. And so really by scaling and automating through, you can implement many tools to make sure like your cloud configurations are closed, that people aren't accessing. These are the ways that you're going to really be able to drive some real-time operational metrics and really be able to give that visibility on real time. Like I said, if you wait until that audit or that, your external auditors come in, it's just too late and you have too much to remediate. So to really measure things, try to implement, discovery tools, things that will continuously monitor for configuration changes, et cetera, to really give your leadership the right visibility.
Thank you, Cynthia. I think this is actually an excellent path to closing our session. I'm just hearing we have a few audience questions that we will address. The first one was actually specifically directed to you, Cynthia. What's the best way to harmonize frameworks? Is there a tool you prefer? And also part of the question is NIST continues to add controls. So we're coming now to Ref 5. That's a reference to NIST SP 853. Yeah, question to you, Cynthia. Is there a best way to do this?
There are definitely tools, and I'm sure MetricStream would be happy to talk to you about that. But I would say that I really find it's important to anchor yourself to one framework, whether that's the ISO 27001, which has been tried and true. It's generic enough yet specific enough to cover all the domains. And then to Komitas' point, you have to really adjust it to you and your business model. But in the US, the NIST cybersecurity framework is another really great one. I really particularly like the images that they provided with the 5 different pillars. I think that really helps people who are not in cybersecurity understand the concept of what you're trying to do. You're trying to protect, respond, etc. So, unfortunately, I wouldn't say that there's the right way or the best way. There's just many ways. And unfortunately, a lot of them have to do with Excel spreadsheets or implementing a common control framework through a tool such as MetricStream.
Okay, thank you for the answer. And I think we all agree there's no best way. And I think in the question, this was not really, there was no expectation that you say there's the golden solution here. The next question, and I think, Helen, I would like to ask you about, ask you to respond. That's a little bit in the COVID-19 context. What tactical approaches can be taken to ensure cyber resilience for remote workers, and also specifically in the education sector, remote learning? Obviously, we all know in the current context that this is a huge topic.
Yeah, I will start with a couple metrics, right? 90% of the incident involved people working within the company. With all the remote working, oftentimes the employees use their personal device to handle the work that expose, really expose the company even higher chance of being attacked. And then on average, each attack cost the company $3.86 million. So that's being said, it's so critical, right? You saw I talk about the people, process, technology perspective. Organization really need to have an inventory list, right? Understand, do an audit, understand what are the endpoint security they have, who has access to what system, and then who has remote access to their system. If they do they have VPN in place, for example? What are the firewalls they have? And then also, if you have a global workforce, you have also to understand the dynamic of that, and then where the risk points are, and then having the audit. And I would say perform that audit is having really assess your risk landscape to begin with. That's the first tactical step I would go with, and really have a much deeper understanding about if you build a defense, you build a layers of defense, and what are the layers going to be included in there. So that's the first thing I would do.
Thank you very much, Helen, for the answer. I think it's a hallmark of a great panel that we're running out of time. I think we're going very deep, and I think the 4 of us, we could continue for a few hours. Let me just take the last question from our audience, and I'm sorry we have to limit to this last one. And I would ask Komitas to comment on it. It's basically a question how to summarize our whole panel, if you will. End-to-end visibility is a must-have for an enterprise to operate effectively. So what's the role of cyber risk management in this? And what are the key steps an organization should take to ensure 360-degree visibility? Can you take a stab at that, Komitas? It's, of course, like the very big picture question.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a great question. It's really a great question. And I started my talk talking about governance. So when you're talking about cyber risk management, risk management is also part of governance. And sometimes some professionals say cybersecurity is more about people and less about technologies. I would like to rephrase this and say cybersecurity is about people and technologies. Without technologies, we cannot deal with cybersecurity risk. Without people, we cannot deal with cybersecurity risk. Without proper governance, we cannot do that. So let me just bring one example and finish this panel. Today we had a phishing attack, and imagine how busy is governor of the central bank. But he found time to forward this phishing email to me and my colleagues to work on and stop this phishing attack. So this is part of culture. When top management leadership create proper culture in the organization. When people working in the organization think that cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility, then I can say there is proper atmosphere, there is proper culture in that organization, and we can say we are doing right things in the right way. Thank you.
I think that is a statement where I don't want to add anything. Thank you. So other than thank you, Helen, thank you, Cynthia, thank you, Komitas. This was a really fun conversation, and I hope we will continue this soon. Thank you very much. And thank you for our audience for staying on. Have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.